My interjections to a minimum. We'll just proceed down the row with Professor Kanahara. We'll start. Each of you has about 5 minutes, and we'll go ahead. Please.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good afternoon or good evening. Atsuko Kanehara. I'm very happy to be here with you all, and I would like to express my sincere gratitude to the organizer of this conference. I would like to take up 3 points. Throughout this conference, key words are rule-based. So I would like to talk about 2 points regarding rule-based. And the third point is related to the freedom of navigation. As yesterday, I did not have opportunity to make a comment on this issue. First, regarding rule-based, I would like to share a possible concrete meaning of the rule of law in the context of maritime order. The rule of law is originated in domestic laws, and it has different meanings depending on countries. But what is the rule of law in the context of maritime order? Let me repeat Vice Commandant Kanose's explanation about this. Late Prime Minister Shinzo Abe declared 3 principles of the rule of law in the context of maritime order. On the occasion of the 13th Shangri-La Dialogue, 3 principles are as follows. First, states shall make and clarify their claims based on international law. Second, states shall not use force or coercion in trying to drive their claims. Third, states shall seek to settle dispute by peaceful means. These 3 principles are, at least somehow, dealt with by the previous sessions. I really would like to appreciate the organizer for having set such important agenda for this conference. And as a Japanese, I'm really proud of late Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. Second, regarding rule-based, we need to think about not only existing law, but also new laws to be required for the maritime security. The typical example is the issue of sabotage against undersea infrastructure, which is also among the conference agenda. To protect undersea infrastructure, UNCLOS does not provide for enough provisions. It is totally understandable, as UNCLOS was adopted in 1982, when nobody could expect that technological development regarding undersea infrastructure. So, this is lack of existing law, lack of UNCLOS and the law of the sea. Therefore, creation of new rules is required. Third point, as I was not given an opportunity to make a comment yesterday, I would like to take up the issue of freedom of navigation. Regarding freedom of navigation, nobody argue against that. Every country recognizes that. But how about combating measures against infringement on the freedom of navigation? In this regard, let's remember the discussion under the United Nations Security Council that dealt with the Galaxy Leader incident. The Galaxy Leader was violently attacked by Houthi rebels in the Red Sea. This is definitely a serious infringement on the freedom of navigation and the safety of navigation. In the United Nations Security Council, three opinions, at least to my knowledge, three types of opinions were heard. First, responding measures should be strictly within the framework of the law of the sea. Second, even beyond the framework of the law of the sea, repelling the violent attacks at sea should be permitted. Third, self-defense should be allowed by attacking military bases from where missiles are launched, targeting vessels at the sea. So we are facing serious difference of opinions regarding combating measures on infringement of the freedom of navigation and the safety of navigation. I think this issue should be discussed among us for the purpose of regional and international cooperation for the freedom of navigation and for the safety of navigation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kanahara-san. Ian?
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thanks to the organizers for having me here. All right, so 5 minutes. I've got 5 points. Hopefully I'll be able to make it in 5 minutes. And the point obviously is not to run out the clock and sort of hog the, all the limelight. All right, so reflections. I think the first point I'd like to raise is there's an issue, of course, of centrality, of agency that comes up time and time again, especially in relation to ASEAN. I think it's important to think a little bit hard about what all this means. I think ASEAN is pretty effective on some of the economic issues, in terms of getting free trade agreements, so on and so forth. But it is a fact that we, in ASEAN, have a greater difficulty in dealing with A, crises, and B, sort of thinking about crisis prevention. And when we think about the South China Sea, those are realities. I get it that these things are troublesome and difficult, and people don't want to talk about them. But in terms of the alternatives, there was talk about having some sort of G2. If that is really the case, and if people are okay with G2, and I sometimes hear people talking about being okay with multipolarity, what that means in practice often, it means is for medium and smaller sized powers, tend to be ASEAN members, to not really have any agency, not to have any space. If you think about the history of multipolarity, it's about major powers carving up the world and having their spheres of influence, right? So if that's not a world that ASEAN states like to be in, some thinking about how to get around it might be important, starting with issues on the South China Sea for one. Which gets me to my second point. I think there has to be a realization that some of these difficulties come into the fact that in ASEAN we have a serious collective action problem. No one wants to move first. There are different parochial interests. So to sort of get on the same page can take a long time. It can be very difficult. And so in that regard, we do have to think about capacity building and institution building in ways that perhaps the ASEAN of the past, is maybe a time, that's sort of, we have to sort of move past that period. But those are difficult conversations to have, I understand, but I think they are necessary conversations to have. Then this gets me to my three sort of more specific points that are worth thinking about. A lot has been said about the rule of law, a lot has been said about the code of conduct, and getting to some sort of agreement on the code of conduct. But the nagging question that I have in my mind when these things come up is the question of enforcement. If we have a binding code of conduct, and there's violation, as in many cases with international law there are, who is going to enforce? How are we going to enforce? If we don't have an answer to that, then the binding code of conduct, is really not going to go anywhere in practical terms. I understand that everyone wants to talk it up because no one wants to sort of be the one seen to be pouring the cold water and pulling things back. But I think it's an important, conversation to actually have, especially in the context where major powers are trying to change, hollow out the meaning of text. You see texts that are out there, and then major powers say, no, they don't mean those things anymore, they mean something else. If that's the world we're getting into, even if we have a binding text, it does not matter, right? Much less to say that, if we have no way to actually enforce these things. Now, the fourth point on neutrality. This comes up quite a bit too with discussion about Southeast Asia. Some of it has been, okay, we'll work with whoever, as long as it's in our interest, as long as there's no pressure, sure. As long as there's sort of pressure, we'll need to sort of bend to pressure. As smaller states, we have to deal with this. Yes, I understand that sentiment. However, that is also an invitation for bigger powers to squeeze you harder. If one side feels they're not getting their way, they'll squeeze you, then the other side will follow, and you end up, instead of not taking sides, being caught in the middle. So that is a reality that I think in Southeast Asia we have to recognize as a risk. And this talk about neutrality, that whole, the strong do what they can, the weak suffer what they must, that was in response to the millions in the Million Dialogue of the history of the Peloponnesian War, saying that they want neutrality. Right? So neutrality doesn't necessarily have to be respected. People think about Switzerland, but they've got mountains. They're pretty well armed. Belgium was neutral before the First and Second World War. They were the first to be invaded. Cambodia, right? Just in case you're thinking I'm being too sort of European, Cambodia in the 1970s was neutral. Its neutrality was violated by Vietnam, by the United States, and subsequently by the PRC as well. So neutrality, well, it's not just talk. You have to back it up with some capability. And I think that's, to believe that neutrality is a trump card is perhaps a little bit too glib. And I suppose the last point I have then has to do with information. There is, of course, a lot of, there's a lot of information around today. There's a lot of confusion, there's a lot of contention, but I think all the more having independent, clear sources of information, there can be arguments, but that's certainly important to do for us not to try to be on the same page. I think that leaves more room for miscalculation, for misunderstanding, and for problems to arise. So, if I'm clearly not shooting lasers at anybody, but this is something that you do want to think about, right? All right, that's it.
A fun, neat trick to keep the audience alert. Well done, Ian, well done. Ewan, you're up.
Great. Thanks very much, Brad. I'm a little bit concerned about Ian's use of the green laser. We've heard about that from
I'm not using a laser at all.
Fake news, fake laser. Okay, let's get down to it. We need to understand that China approaches the South China Sea with wider geopolitical objectives than just domination of the land, the sea, and the resources within the South China Sea, as important though that is. And I agree with Ray Powell when he said that the ability to control the sea is also a step-changing factor from previous decades. But I assert that China intends to condition Southeast Asia into a subservient relationship. That's part of what the South China Sea play is about. And hence Beijing's interest in maintaining a code of conduct negotiation with all 11 ASEAN members as an open-ended process. The code of conduct enables China to exploit ASEAN's common denominator interest in conflict avoidance while continuing to pursue its expansionist and exclusionary agenda below the threshold of armed conflict. And here, that gets back to our opening panel session. Is there a downside to jaw rather than war? And I go back also to the previous panelist, Ms. Olberg, who said that there is, in fact, a cost to a bad faith dialogue, and I think that the code of conduct is actually a bad faith dialogue. We've all heard about China's winning without fighting strategy, but to succeed, it needs to find an equivalent in ASEAN of losing without fighting. Maybe that's harsh, but for most of Southeast Asia, a never-ending negotiation is good enough if this avoids war with China. Vietnam, amongst the claimants, has a different approach at the national level of playing China at its own game in the South China Sea and avoiding a frontal confrontation. But among the others, only the Philippines publicly resists and defies China's dominance game in the South China Sea. It does this through its transparency campaign, which we've heard all about, and more importantly, in my view, by convening a coalition in waiting of like-minded countries from outside of Southeast Asia, including, of course, the United States, Australia, Japan, Canada, New Zealand. All of them have now concluded access agreements of one type or another with the Philippines defense authorities, and France and the UK are in the queue. If I'd be permitted a brief plug on the Australian side of things, I've just published a report for ASPI, which is free available if you want to look at that relationship. Why does the South China Sea matter to these like-minded countries? Well, it's important as a maneuver and flow space. We know all about that. But also, what happens in the South China Sea doesn't stay in the South China Sea. If China can carve out an exclusive space for itself in the South China Sea, then it will have ripple effects in the Indian Ocean region, the South Pacific, even Antarctica. Not to the same level of control, but still corrosive of sovereign equality. The point about the rules-based order is that rules and laws operate on precedent. UNCLOS is not just about who gets the fish and the oil. As Jeffrey or Daniel said in the opening to this conference, UNCLOS is not a Western instrument. That's often forgotten. It defines the territorial integrity itself of several post-colonial archipelagic states, including the two largest ones in this region, Philippines, where we are, and Indonesia, as well as Fiji and Papua New Guinea. Does China respect the archipelagic concept? No. Like the rest of UNCLOS, it cherry-picks the bits it likes, like straight baselines which are asserted in the Paracel Islands, while it also claims freedom of navigation through the Philippines and Indonesian archipelagos. Southeast Asia has more at stake in UNCLOS than most, because the legal principle that land dominates the sea offers the best protection against the alternative that China dominates Southeast Asia. In sum, the South China Sea is an arena for a power game. That power game is to decide whether Southeast Asia's future international relations are defined by rule of law and sovereign equality, or whether its might makes right based on power. Yes, the South China Sea disputes are complicated, as Dr. Hu said in the session earlier today, but the core issues are simple.
Thank you. Thank you, Ewan. Thank you. 3 excellent presentations. Once again, we'll proceed with the usual. Put your placards up if you've got a comment. I would rather not, I'm going to ask a couple of questions myself, so you've got a few minutes to think, but I do want to prime you. I'm not so much interested in you responding necessarily to these presentations as you take on the mission that we've all been given, which is to think about takeaways from the last 2 days of discussions. What are the big themes? What are the issues that we need to be addressing? And I want to thank Ewan for taking one of my questions, and I want to pose it to the other 2 panelists, and I want to take advantage of the fact that we have none of our Chinese participants here on the dais with us. And I do want to applaud them, by the way, for coming and for taking all of the heat that they have encountered over the last 2 days. It takes a considerable bit, I think, of presence and confidence to be here, and I want to thank you all for taking the time to join us and to presenting and making sure that we hear the Chinese view. But what I would like to hear from
and Ewan, if you want to follow it, even though I think you've answered it, but from Ian and Professor Kanahara, is the Chinese have been beaten up quite badly over the last 2 days over these issues, I would say, from our perspective. And they've been quite unyielding, nevertheless, in the positions that they've taken on these questions. And I would want to ask you, why is that? What is it that you sense? Why is China so firmly committed to these issues? What is it? And I think, Ewan offered us one answer, that this is about far more than just the resources or freedom of navigation, but reflects fundamental rights. And I'd be curious to hear what they and what perhaps others think. Why is it that China is so willing to take such abuse and be beaten up as consistently as they have been in this conversation? Why? What animates that particular position? Ian?
I'm not in any position to speak for the PRC. But,
and I'm not asking you to, but for your interpretation.
My interpretation would be, I've got two. One about taking the beating is because they can. So individuals will take a beating here. It's not going to change any behavior. It's not going to change any of the claims. So you want to look like you're engaged. You do want to get your point across, and you want to, emphasize your points. So I totally get it. That's one answer. And the other is, when I look at the 9-dash lines, I'm somewhat historically minded, as you might guess. I look at some of the maps from the Cold War, and I look at the East Asian co-prosperity sphere, and on my way to insulting everybody, in case you haven't noticed, they cover very similar areas. Why? Because it's a similar question about access denial, being able to get to resources, being able to make sure that your lines of communication are unimpeded. It doesn't have to be China, it doesn't have to be the PRC. I think any actor who is looking at who's in East Asia and looking at their points of vulnerability will come up to very similar conclusions. We heard our Japanese friends talk about that. They, of course, have a different answer, but the considerations are similar. We've heard our Korean friends talk about it. Considerations are similar. I think part of it is a fact of geography and a fact of Chinese capability.
Kanahara-san?
Thank you very much. I'm expert on international law, so I would like to answer to your question from a perspective of international law. I would like to say 2 points. First, in the history of public international law, of course, the European countries in the 18th century established public international law. So afterwards, developing countries and also countries which are former colonies of developed countries participated in international society. And the common attitude of those countries are, for instance, emphasizing sovereignty to refuse new legal regulation against their will, against their interest. And they also emphasize the equitable share of interest and equitable share of resources. So I think China, of course, now really big power, but still now China has such a kind of attitude. It's very strange to me. And second, China, at least in relation to Japan, maybe always thinking about history, inherent history, which was between China and Japan. So from legal perspective and historical perspective between China and Japan, maybe these 2 points can somehow explain China's attitude, at least in the East China Sea. And in this regard, 2 other speakers have their own position toward South China Sea. As a Japanese, we Japanese are always think that what takes place in the South China Sea will take place in the East China Sea. So we are always watching what is happening in the South China Sea. In addition to that, as yesterday's session we discussed, South China Sea is really a global common and very important sea route for Japan to transport natural resources. From this perspective too, Japan is always looking at the stability of South China Sea. Thank you.
I would also, I think, note that the Korean, as was pointed out in the panel on economic security, Koreans would note that it's also occurring up in their waters as well. So I think that the fact that it is a demonstration effect, as Ewan said, or something like that, is actually quite well taken. I want to make one other comment, and then I'm going to and I've got a whole bunch of placards up, and we'll get to them. We're going to sort of work our way around the room. But I would also say there's a brand new study that just came out of RAND think tank last month, about 2 weeks ago, that talks about great power competition between the United States and China. And it identifies 3 potential flashpoints, which are, the 3 are Taiwan, the South China Sea, and the science and technology competition. And the argument that the authors make essentially is that we, decision makers and policy makers in Washington and Beijing, need to bound the US-China competition to ensure that it does not deteriorate into a binary zero-sum terminal spiral into conflict. And I guess what strikes me is the fact that there seems to be in that analysis a certain urgency to addressing the problems that we're talking about in this conference, in this setting. And yet, I don't sense, and I haven't sensed, any urgency at all in the conversations that we've had. I'm sure the Filipinos feel quite pressed. But it seems to me the rest of the world just really doesn't seem to think it's that big of a problem for them, other than in this abstract sense of the demonstration effect. And I don't sense any urgency in our conversation. I think we would have a very different kind of, this session would be quite different if we did, in fact, feel that compelling interest and need. I want to leave it with that. Now I'm going to go to comments. We'll take several. Again, you don't need to respond to what they've said, but I would ask you to be thinking about key takeaways from the last 2 days. I'm going to ask you to be briefer than I've been. If you have a question directed to someone, you need not, but do leave the floor for as many comments as possible. Renato, I've got you already. You're okay, don't worry. But we're going to start over here. There was a second row on the left here behind, and then I'm going to go to John. But who was up the placard first? I think it was the one that was furthest to the left. Sure, go ahead. I can't read from this distance, so the lights are appalling.
Hello? Okay. All right, thank you very much. These 2 days are actually very interesting topics, sharing insights from different experts in their respective fields. However, I just noticed one aspect that should be included in future Manila dialogues on the South China Sea. As I am the executive director of the Philippine International Law of the Sea Academy, I just noticed that there is less substantive discussions on the principles of international law, particularly emphasizing law of the sea. As I observed, there are much discussions on maritime security, maritime defense, and cooperation among states such as the Coast Guards, which is also very important in these discussions. But
particularly when they're paying for the meeting, yes.
But I really wanted to see more international law and law of the sea dialogues integrated into this geopolitical discussions. Thank you very much.
Duly noted. Ms. Isaac. Ms. Isaac, next to you since you're right next there.
Hello, good afternoon. So, My question is, what are the specific non-negotiable principles of UNCLOS and customary international law that must be prioritized and defended to prevent the rules-based order from becoming so diluted by competing interests that it loses all practical and legal authority in the South China Sea?
Thank you. I think if we could also, to the audience, is for those of you that have expertise, I mean, we've been talking about principles. I would be interested in knowing how exactly do you defend these principles? What does, I mean, empty words, what are we talking about actually doing? John, we're working our way around.
As far as I know, Ian is not equipped with a laser. No, but my question is this, and it's a general one, and one of you might take it up. As I've been going through my sidebar conversations and coffee breaks, a point that's come up time and time again is that the Taiwan issue was very rarely, maybe perhaps never, raised in last year's forum. And this year it's been one of the most key topics. So I wonder about your reflections. Do you think that's just because of who came this year and where the conversation went, an artifact of the conference or maybe its modality? Or does it reflect a broader shift in the geostrategic environment in only 1 year?
And I think there's the related question is, which was on my list, is in fact, should we be separating Taiwan from the South China Sea discussion, or are they an integrated whole? I'd be curious what the general views are. Renato, your hand is up. I've got you. Yes. Go
I'll
ahead.
answer you. The issue of Taiwan and the South China Sea is related, and that came no less from the Chinese themselves. When in March 2010, it was announced China has 3 core interests: Taiwan, South China Sea, and Tibet, and repeated by President Xi Jinping when he met Barack Obama in 2012 in Sunnyland. When China was talking about new great power relationship, the United States should not intervene in China's 3 core interests: Taiwan, South China Sea, and Tibet. My question is, from the point of view of the panel members, what's the relationship of China's effort to control 90% of the South China Sea with its, what the Chinese would often say, their core interest, which is, of course, Taiwan?
Thank you, Renato. Mr. Saini, since we're just working away on.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Gaurav. I am from New Delhi, a think tank called the Council for Strategic and Defense Research. I have 3 very quick points. First is a reflection on the discussions yesterday. I was a little disappointed that where I found researchers and analysts from ASEAN countries not really calling out what the problem is. I think the defense was that we are not really a party to this dispute, therefore we don't really have a stand. I think we can still call things out if we think they're wrong, and I'll tell you why. The second and third points are related because I think yesterday India was brought in by a Chinese expert in terms of we should learn from the India-China conflict and how well that has been managed. First point that was made was that somehow this idea that it is okay to use larger boats to ram into smaller ones to settle a dispute is fine, or it's a Western idea. I'm from India. We are not the West, but we are not anti-West. But I can tell you that that's not a Western idea. That's a sort of common thing that everybody understands. And I think if we propose that this is a Western idea, then we are really setting the bar very low for what is the non-West. The third point is, which was raised about believing in Chinese intentions. I think we did that in India. After independence, we nominated them for the UNSC. Even after the 1962 war with China, we believed in the intentions, but I think now we need to look at behavior. And it is regarding that behavior where we don't see any change. Unless we have any evidence to the contrary, I don't think we should end up believing just because we are recalibrating our position and our relationship with China that the threat is perceived as less. So I just wanted to clarify those points.
Thank you. Let's go back to the panel now. Kanahara-san?
Thank you very much for the questions. And as I am expert of international law, I would like to answer to the first and the second question. First, not question, your desire. Desire that future Manila dialogue should deal with more substance of international law. As an international professor, I totally agree with you. But at the same time, I'm always enjoying the discussion here in the South China Manila dialogue because I love interdisciplinary discussion. And even though the agenda is not related to exactly substance of international law, you and I could intervene from a legal perspective as an international law expert. That is the not answer but comment to your desire. And the second question, UNCLOS and customary international. Your question is related to UNCLOS Treaty, Convention, and customary international law. I think always it is very strange and also it is in some sense disappointed. The fact is, China is a party to UNCLOS. The United States is not a party to UNCLOS. So if I are a China, if I were criticized by the United States based upon the law of the sea, I would say, you are not party to UNCLOS. If you criticize me from the perspective of the law of the sea, you should be party to UNCLOS. Maybe I would say that. And customary international law. Yesterday, there was a session whose title is History versus Law, something like that. But as I explained yesterday, China, of course, China's 9 shrine are based upon history. But according to China's formal position papers which were issued on the occasion of the South China Sea dispute, China's historic rights based upon, they say, customary international law. So customary international law, in some sense, could be abused. And I think at that time and now, there is no such customary international law which China tried to rely on. And I would like to repeat that customary international law is not a tool to legally justify claims that violate UNCLOS and existing law. So I'm sorry, I could not answer to the third question and fourth question regarding Taiwan. And to be honest, maybe due to a sort of howling, I could not hear the fifth question. I'm very sorry, so I would like to stop here.
All right. So on international law, I think those are important conversations to have, and I would really, I think to have interjections would be very helpful. But there is also the fact that we've heard yesterday evening how some countries may think about international law as important, but somewhat flexible. So if that is the case, of course, it suggests that if that's a trajectory, if more states take that position, it means to say that it becomes a lot more difficult to believe in commitments, treaties, and other kinds of instruments that parties enter into. If that, for international lawyers, is not a world that you like to see, perhaps some interjection on those grounds might be helpful. On the matter of Taiwan, look, I don't take any position in Taiwan. I'm Singaporean. I'm from a country that shouldn't have existed. So on that front, I understand that as an academic, right, borders change, new states get formed, and states get taken over. That's just how history works. But I guess for the PRC, the issue of Taiwan is very much tied into how they see themselves and their identity and their legitimacy. That's really their thing. What I think concerns me and perhaps others is that you're looking at geographically an entity that sits on an important body of water for shipping, for air routes, for submarine cables. So, any major disruption would be highly costly and very disruptive. And if you look at the way that Southeast Asian economies work, essentially we are a hub, right? We import a whole bunch from the PRC and we sell then to developed economies like the US, like Europe, like Japan. We get investment, actually more investment from the US and Japan and Europe in order to process those things that those goods that we've imported from the PRC. So that circulation has to keep going. If there's a disruption to that circulation, it will be very damaging for our economy. So just on that sort of very, I guess, materialist ground, I would say that's why there's interest in Taiwan, without having to state any position on what it is or is not.
On the question of international law, I included a fair amount in my comments because I think it is vital to leveling up the Southeast Asian asymmetric power equation with China. That's why it matters. But as Ian said in an earlier round of comments, the big weakness is the lack of enforcement that's attached to UNCLOS. With no UNCLOS police sailing around the South China Sea, it's obviously going to be subordinate to questions of power, and I think that a conference like this needs to blend both the power equation and the geopolitical equation together with the question of international law. In terms of differentiating from other conferences that are in the market, if you like, this conference has just followed on rapidly from the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam's conference. Having attended that in previous years, there is a very strong international law component there. So I think the Manila dialogue should seek out its own ground, and I think that to have a power perspective that is equal, if not greater, is fair enough in my view. On the question of, from John, I'm badly qualified to make a comparison with last year because I wasn't here. But it's no surprise that Taiwan features more in a Philippines-based conference than it does elsewhere in Southeast Asia for reasons of geography. Strategic location of the Philippines means that it will be involved in a Taiwan contingency, like it or not. And I think that bullet has been swallowed, if you like. In conversations that I've had, that there's a realism in the Philippines that there isn't, frankly, in other Southeast Asian situations. And this question about whether all of these maritime disputes in the East Asia constitute a single theater keeps coming up. I think if you're in the Philippines, that's a very persuasive proposition. A contingency that happens in the South China Sea could easily escalate to become a Taiwan contingency. Vice versa, a Taiwan contingency would, in all probability, escalate to become a South China Sea contingency. They're not far away from each other. And I think that Southeast Asian countries that believe you can artificially separate one from the other and ignore Taiwan and deal with the South China Sea, that's not rooted in reality, in my view. And if you shift the map to China's perspective, you're looking out on all that waterfront in common. As we heard from our Korean participant in the last economy session, it's clear that in Seoul, too, even though it's further away, what happens in the South China Sea affects the temperature and the mood in Korea, too. So I think there is a very high degree of strategic connectivity across the whole Western Pacific waterfront. And I think that, just one final thought on the law question, there has been speculation that the Philippines at some stage might pursue a second case. I think that would be a very interesting question to reintroduce into the agenda for a future conference. I'd like to hear more about the potential modality of that. I think the Philippines has been at the forefront of it, but it's not only the Philippines' interest that rides on that. I think other Southeast Asian countries have been willing to let Philippines do their work for them in some senses, although it only dealt with the area in direct contention between the Philippines and China. The broader judgment that the 9-dash line lacked legitimacy obviously had a major positive effect. And the beauty of that judgment, even if it didn't have an instant effect, is it's open-ended, and there is no appeal to it. It will run and run. And that's the subtle strength of international law.
You know, at our opening session, I mentioned that there seems to be a tension between law and diplomacy, and that we've not quite resolved at that time. And 2 days later, we still have a tension, and it's still, we're going to get to you, just be patient, Ms. Yi. And we still haven't resolved that tension. What I'm struck, though, what's come out is that it's one thing for a stronger party to resent or to ignore the law, it seems, when it thwarts its ambitions. What's always fascinating to me in these conversations is the fact that weaker countries that would seem as well to be benefiting from the potential application of the law seem indifferent in some ways to following through and to seeing that it's enforced too. And that's kind of, I don't know, ironic perhaps is the word, but dumb is another word that comes to my mind. And that, I think that gets to the larger question which I was getting at about how do we make, I mean, we can talk about what laws are important. How is it that we enforce this? How do we make international law meaningful? And I still haven't heard an answer to that question. And unless you've got one for me, we don't need to talk about this anymore. Now let's go back to questions. John Hemmings, you're next in my queue.
Hello. Yeah, sorry. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you for moderating, Brad. I think my question is a little bit double-parted, but it's not two questions. It's one question.
As long as it's a quick question.
Which is, my reading is that the Philippines have done really well internationalizing the South China Sea and their perspective of the transparency perspective, but that ASEAN has not quite yet, as a collective, been captured by the Philippine strategy. So if this year, 2026, is an opportunity for the Philippines, I think, what is your recommendations to the Philippines? What should they be doing for this year? And then the second part of that is, what should the international community be doing to support the Philippines in that?
Mind you, this is a takeaway session, so it doesn't need to be a question just for the panel. You can offer your own thoughts, John, or anybody else that's got insight into this.
Are you telling me off?
If need be. The person next to you.
Hi, it's Ray.
Hi, Ray.
I've noticed that in this particular corner you have a line of sight problem with the moderator because they've got this camera strategically positioned. I just wanted to offer as a takeaway one more analogy, because you know how much I like analogies, and I say this as the son of a civil rights protester from the 60s, and that is that of, in considering the Philippines' tactic of transparency, the analogy to nonviolent direct action. And that was the tactic employed by the civil rights movement in the 1960s in the United States. You might think of Mahatma Gandhi, or even the 2014 oil rig crisis off of Vietnam, which is essentially to point out the illegality or injustice of a particular action by someone who has a large power asymmetry. So someone much stronger than you are is doing something unjust. And so what you do is you demonstrate for your own people and for outsiders that there is an injustice going on, and it takes a tremendous amount of courage, restraint, resilience, professionalism. My father had to go through training to learn how not to hit back when he was hit, and resolve. And so, you know, when we consider this, and I'm not sure we've ever seen it to this scale at a state level, you know, so we've seen it, again, as resistance movements in other contexts. But to Ewan's point, it's also related in some cases to a legal action. In the case of my father, it was the Supreme Court decision on desegregating the interstate transit system that led to the Freedom Rides of 1961, in which they were trained to go down into the Deep South, to go into the opposite waiting room. So if you were white, then you went in the colored waiting room. If you were colored, you went in the white waiting room. And you let yourself either get beat up or arrested. and then build up the jails. This is very actually reminiscent in many ways and analogous to what the Philippines has been doing, and I think we should just sort of sit back for a second and think about how extraordinary this is in history. Thank you.
Fascinating analogy. I don't think, have we used the word justice over the last couple of days? If it's an intriguing way to frame this. Mr. Dharmawan, behind you.
Right, thank you very much. Just a very quick question. So reflecting on our conversation in the past couple of days, what recommendations or suggestions that we would give to the Philippines, as the Philippines assuming the ASEAN chairmanships next year? What are the things that the Philippines can do differently, and particularly in regards to push the conversation on the code of conduct negotiations going forward? Thank you.
Great. Ms. Yi, you're going to get the last word, and then we'll go back to the panel. But not too long a last word, although you get several words.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for acknowledging that we are being the target of punching bags for the last 2 days. I mean, it took me a lot of courage to come every time. I hope I go back in one piece. But, I mean, firstly, I want to just, well, there are too many accusations or blames on China. I mean, I can't even do the whole rebuttal. If I do it,
you don't have to do the entire
it would
rebuttal.
take another 2 days.
No.
But I'll just pick up on two things. One is history. I think China is the one that really values history because our memories of century of humiliation. And I won't go into details of it, but I will do this. I must respectfully protest against mixing South China Sea issues with Taiwan issues. Taiwan is an internal issue of China, full stop. Now, beyond stating that position clearly, let me explain why conflating these issues is analytically wrong and strategically counterproductive for this forum's work. I'll do it in 90 seconds. But I'll read it from the script because this is just two important issues that I want to get it right. The South China Sea involves disputes between multiple sovereign states over maritime features. I don't think there are other sovereign states that does not uphold a one China policy that has an official diplomatic relationship with China. There are overlapping claims in the South China Sea, ongoing negotiations through ASEAN frameworks, space for bilateral and multilateral crisis management mechanisms. ASEAN plays a mediating role to some extent. Functional cooperation is achievable without resolving sovereignty. We've discussed that for the last 2 days already. And Taiwan is fundamentally different. It involves China's territorial integrity and reunification, a qualitatively different issue from maritime boundary disputes between states. That is very important. The frameworks are incompatible. The dynamics are zero-sum in the ways that South China Sea issues don't have to be. There is no ASEAN mediation role in any of this. The crisis management mechanism I've already advocated today simply don't apply to that. Here's why mixing them would damage this forum's work. When we import Taiwan into South China Sea discussions, we lose focus on achievable crisis management. We force ASEAN states to take positions on issues beyond their scope when they are trying to manage maritime disputes. We turn every practical discussions about fishing access, communication protocols, or incident prevention into ideological debates about major power conflicts. If we cannot manage South China Sea crisis effectively, and right now we cannot, we certainly cannot resolve Taiwan questions in this venue. This is not the venue for the Taiwan question. So let's focus this forum on what it was convened to address. Establishing mechanisms that prevent collisions, save lives, Chinese lives and Filipino lives and ASEAN lives, and reduce conflict risk in the South China Sea. The crisis management principles apply across issues, communication channels, incident prevention, forward-looking approach, not backward-looking. But each issue requires context-specific solutions. For the South China Sea, those solutions exist and work elsewhere. Let's replicate success rather than guarantee failure by mixing incompatible challenges.
Thank you, Monsieur. I appreciate that, and I remind everyone that we are here in our individual capacities today, and I appreciate that statement, official statement. And I would ask, you believe all of that? That's your personal opinion. Very good. Thank you. Then I think we understand, and I'm not sure we didn't understand, but thank you for laying that out so clearly. I have one more person in the queue. Oh, no, we're going to go around for another round. But you were the gentleman in the back. I'm sorry, I don't have your name. Again, I can't see you. And then we'll go back to the speakers, and then I've got time for another round.
Thank you for giving me the last, or maybe one of the very last comments. I just wanted to say that overall, interesting discussions, but I felt one point was frustrating me. I felt that we didn't really hear about what the Chinese may propose to us, or what we may propose to them, or what may be acceptable to them as a solution. And I have nothing specific to propose here. It's just I would really appreciate if the next time there can be some sort of negotiation game, some simulation, or a way where we could say in this scenario or this scenario or this scenario, this is acceptable, this is not acceptable. What can we try to work out to improve the situation?
Great. I think scenarios are always fun. They're just difficult to do with a group this size. Anyone on the panel care to respond to any of the comments that we've heard? Don't. Ian, please.
I think that John Hemmings' question and the question that followed can kind of run together. They were both to do with the opportunity that's in the Philippines' lap with the ASEAN chairmanship next year. First point to note, chairmanship doesn't give you carte blanche powers, so we should moderate our idea that the Philippines will be able to showcase it into whatever it wants. There will be a constraining effect of being in the chair as well. But having said that, I think the convening opportunity is huge. And with imagination, that can really run in the Philippines' favor in two avenues. One is to make an advantage of the fact that ASEAN will have to come to Manila, including ASEAN media, which has been a problem up until now. We've discussed this, in fact, in one previous side session, the frustration of those who are leading the transparency campaign in being unable to get widespread Southeast Asian interest. Well, you'll have those widespread Southeast Asian interests, so use it creatively, integrate it within the ASEAN agenda. I'm not saying that you should necessarily take them all to the Sierra Madre and back, but nonetheless, you can see what I'm driving at. The other convening opportunity is China. The president in his keynote didn't shut the door on communication with China. I think that was a clear signal that I hope our Chinese delegates will also take back, that the Philippines is not playing a game in which the door is shut. I think it's more subtle than that. At the diplomatic level, Philippines will not want to do that. And I don't think that China will want to stay away either. I don't think China's going to burn its relationship with the rest of ASEAN by throwing a giant sulk. I think they will have to come, and that opens an opportunity for the Philippines, both to mend its relationship, but also to mend by proxy its relationship with the rest of ASEAN, to show that it's not just in the naughty corner and unable to communicate with Beijing. One point, very briefly, on China's strategy, which Benjamin Blandin asked about at the end. I think one thing that we've been told repeatedly, I remember from Dr. Hu and others, is that China is following a responsive strategy. I dispute that. I think it is an active strategy. And many of you will perhaps agree with that, but I think that's something that also we should correct in terms of the narrative that's been presented to us. Although I take your point, Brad, too, that it takes some courage to show up. And I would also add my plaudits to the Chinese delegates for being game to do so.
Before I go to Ian, for those of you, if you have
asked your question, put your placard down. I have narrow bandwidth anyway. It's just hard for me to know. I've got several up, but if those of you that I've already called on, if you don't want to be called on again, put your placard down, please. Ian, comment.
Sure. So I think the Philippines has a tough job as ASEAN chair. They've got, of course, they've got their own disputes that they would like to have some attention drawn to. At the same time, as ASEAN chair, there's a whole plethora of other things. I mean, in case you missed my opening remarks, there's a whole bunch of things I think ASEAN need to work on. So with that having been said, the president here has also talked about how he was going to be he's going to be a responsible ASEAN chair. He's going to have the ASEAN agenda first and foremost. So I think that addresses that sort of issues. I mean. Going back to Taiwan thing, really, when I look at the Cambodia-Thailand conflict, or I look at the Philippines and Malaysia over Sabah, it's not really my issue as long as I don't get directly affected. So insofar as there's any, as long as there's only any sort of talk about Taiwan, it's not about any sovereignty issue. It's just about, look, we're all in this neighborhood. There are ramifications if things get out of control. That's all there is to it. All that other history stuff and all that, that's sure, knock yourself out.
Okay. I've got, I think, 6 people in my queue left, and we have about 18 minutes, I think. So we're going to go through all of you, and I'd ask you to be relatively brief. Then we'll go back to the panel for final comments. Beck, you first.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay, great, thank you. Thank you for a wonderful panel. I'm a little bit reluctant to ask this question because it might leave things on a grim note, but I think we have a tendency to dance around a prospect. This is a panel that is about defending the rules-based order, and my question to all of our panelists is what happens if we can't defend the rules-based order? One of the themes out of the last 2 days is really around the relationship between law and power, and going back to Ewan's points about the global significance of the South China Sea. I wanted to ask our panelists, are we heading towards a post-UNCLOS global maritime order? And if so, what do you think that looks like? Is this going to be about new rules or ineffective rules or no rules? And just finally, alternatively, what can we be optimistic about? Thank you.
That's a fascinating question that we can extrapolate into a lot of different areas about post-rules-based order and how we address it. And I wonder if there are analogies to be drawn or lessons from other applications. So we're thinking about in other ways. Over here, I'm sorry, I can't read your name. You're right in the light. Yes. Yes.
You can hear me? Yes. So because you raised the question at the end of the day about how to enforce international law, and as a person with legal background, I have to admit that there's a lack of enforcement mechanism in international law in general. So I will answer your question by facts. So if you look at the members state of the Security Council at the United Nations, most of them, the United States, China, Russia, and the United Kingdom, all of them were brought into court by smaller states, and all of them lost in the case at international court. And all of them refused to implement or respect the judgment of international court at that moment. But then they, by themselves, by action, they fulfill the requirement and the judgment of the international court without saying it. So in the example between Nicaragua and the United States also disappeared before the court because they disagreed on the jurisdiction of the ICJ. And then the ICJ continued with the case. Then the United States also say that it's non-binding on them, but then they fulfill the judgment of the court. The case between Russia and the Netherlands, Russia also have the same behavior. disappear before the court and dispute on jurisdiction of the court. But then they released the ship of the Netherlands, although they say it's based on their national law rather than international law. But the judgment of the national court come later. Now look at the case between Mauritius and the United Kingdom.
I think we've got that.
Yeah. So all of them, on the powerful state at the Security Council, later in their life, they will follow the judgment of international courts and tribunal. So give or take, it's just 10 years after the South China Sea War. Maybe later China will fulfill in their ways.
Great. I think what's unstated in that, and what I'd like to just pose for everyone to think about, is why? Why is it that they eventually comply? I think it's a great thing. But I think the issue for us is, what is it that we can do to speed that adherence and respect for international law along? Just throw it out. Bryce.
Hi. So the question I have is related to Washington moving away from a liberal internationalist perspective towards one of potentially defensive realism. So what does that mean, as there's been flirtations from the administration related
I'm sorry, what does that mean in normal human language?
So moving from caring about the rules-based order to something more focused on hard power.
Thank you.
Right? What does that mean as Washington is thinking about or flirting with the discussion of a G2 condominium between the PRC and the US related towards maintaining the rules-based order of the South China Sea and other parts of the region? Thank you.
Thank you. Aizawa-san.
Thank you very much. Sorry, going back to the first question raised by you, so additional questions. So could you elaborate your assessment, especially on Chinese security objectives of the military presence in South China Sea? For example, surface-to-air missiles, anti-ship cruise missiles, and additionally, we've seen 3,000 meter class runaway gun batteries, radar communication facilities on these islands in South China Sea. So how they're going to be utilized militarily, you analyze. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ms. Yo.
Get a mic?
There
Oh,
you
it's
go.
all right
Now
now.
you're working.
Thank you. I just wanted to address something about some comments in the room asking whether we will be seeing a post-rules-based order. Living in the same world, we are already living in a post-rules-based order world. We see that in other facets, as I alluded to when I was on the panel. In the area of trade, the WTO is, in essence, non-functioning. Once the US pulled out of the WTO, if the US pulls out of NATO, NATO also is going to be non-functioning. So in that sense, that is the world order that we're living in today. I have a question and then a final comment. So my question is, for those of you who have been working on South China Sea for a long time, and this is not the first conference that you've attended on the South China Sea, what we've seen from our Chinese colleagues who have spoken over the last 2 days, and I do appreciate their presence here because it allows us to see their perspective. One thing that you see from them is that they are consistent in the positions that are held. They're not going to budge. So if you know, like those of you who have been negotiating on South China Sea for a long time, if you know that China is not going to budge on its claims, whether it's got to do with the 9-dash line and so on and so forth, what alternative solutions or strategies are you considering while approaching a China that will not budge? I think this is more of a strategy question that I have for those who have been working on this. And then my final comment is going back to trade again. We know what's happening around the world because of the tariffs that Trump has imposed since Liberation Day this year. I know that's not the topic of the discussion, but again, we cannot speak about South China Sea in isolation. So my suggestion or proposal is that at a time when China needs trading relationships, why can't we in ASEAN consider what China needs, as in trade, as in resources. There's a lot of discussion over rare earth, for example, right now. Can't that be put on the table while negotiating South China Sea? Thank you.
Now there's a constructive suggestion. Is that Mr. Chabra behind you? Please.
Can you hear me? Sasha Chabra from Institute for National Defense Security Research in Taiwan. I wanted to thank our colleague from China who's sort of reminded us to study history. So I just wanted to share a brief quote from 1936 that I like to think about when thinking about China's role in the South China Sea and in Taiwan Strait, which is that if the Korean people want to break free from the shackles of Japanese imperialists, we will warmly support their fight for independence. The same also applies to Taiwan. This was stated by Mao Zedong in 1936. So I ask if we think about historically, Mao and the CCP rejected claims over Taiwan, supported Taiwan independence, but now are coming for Taiwan. We've seen how they've escalated in the South China Sea to have claims against Filipino territory. Is it not true these are all inherently linked? And this is not just the South China Sea, we also have to think about India, we have to think about the Himalayas. So my question, because this is supposed to be a question I guess, is it not true that these all have to be linked as one? Every dispute that China has with its neighbors, they will only succeed if they can de-link this, dealing with the Filipinos on their own, dealing with the Taiwanese on their own, dealing with the Indians on their own, and et cetera, until every country falls. So is it not true that we should link all of these together, and that's the only chance of preserving peace in the region? Thank you.
Well, that's a fascinating strategic question. I do want to keep this conference and this discussion limited to the South China Sea, I think for the interest of sanity and time. My last placard up is Mr. Yang, I believe it is. If anyone else, if no one else, one more person briefly. So that make up three of you then, quickly. Mr. Yang?
Right, kind of wanted to kind of echo what Trisha said. I think one of the questions that I've been having over the last 2 days is exactly the mismatch, but whether all countries, I guess the question for the panelists are, do you see a possibility where all claimant states, I think in this case, the ROC technically is a claimant state, but it's a complicated situation. So can we actually find a way to accept the fragmented reality, focus on maybe sector by sector, or like, is there a better way to move forward with conversation and accept the fact that there will be differences and find a way to, coexist with that?
I think the answer is we have to, and the question that we always come back to is how do we get there? Next to you.
Hi.
It was working.
Yes, Chen from ID in Jetro. Thank you so much for giving me a chance to speak out. I'm learning a lot from all of you, and I think we have know a lot of things about history and dispute, diplomatic, military, but I think we should, for the next year's agenda, I think we should add more things that we are facing in common, such as the resilience issue, the environment degradations, climate change, natural disasters. I think that will serve as at least some common ground to move forward together instead of talking this and with that bring us to nowhere. So I think that would be a good chance for us to move forward for discussions. And do you think that it will be a chance for those stakeholders to work together, or you think that for panelists, the question for panelists is, or you think that maybe there will be another competition arena for all the powers? I think that's my concern, and that's my concern.
Did you get that? We're not going back yet, but I mean, you understood the question, everyone? No? It was a little hard to hear.
Okay,
Can you just rephrase it really short, easily?
Do you think that those common issues, such as environmental issue, can serve as a common ground for all the countries to move forward, or you think that will be another arena for rivalry?
Okay.
Okay, yes.
Last word. Or not. No, wait for the microphone.
Hello? Yes.
Thank you so much. I'm going to keep it really short. It's not as much of a question as a comment, and I'm just going to build on something that everyone else has said. I think that since we are talking about the South China Sea and in Manila, it would be great to see representation in the dialogue next year of Indian participants. I think Philippines has a great friend in India, as do many other countries that are represented here. It's been so great to hear perspectives from the UK, from South Korea, and other parts of the world. I think India and the Philippines spend almost equal amounts of time thinking about what the Chinese are thinking about, as do the Americans and other, of course, other like-minded partners. But India and the Philippines share very distinct geopolitical theaters, but have structural resemblances in the issues we face with China. I think more, collaborations between India and the Philippines are in the pipelines, but discussions at a forum like this will send across strong political signaling, which is, very important. I think one of my esteemed colleagues spoke about the rules-based order and, what happens in the Himalayas and Taiwan matters here. Because a rules-based order cannot only be protected in one part of the world. If we are, going to stand behind a rules-based order, that is something that should be followed across. And what happens at the line of actual control, if China is unchecked at the line of actual control, it gives it the same confidence to, reassert that, dominance in other parts of the world. And same goes here. So that's just my 2 bits here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Got nothing else? We'll go back to the panelists. We'll wrap it up. Everybody gets 2 minutes at most. So, Kanahara-san?
Thank you very much. First, I would like to briefly answer to your excellent question. The law of the sea among the fields of international law is one of the most old field. So the main pillar of UNCLOS can go back to more than 300 years. So the law of the sea, UNCLOS, main pillar of UNCLOS, are most complied with and most relied on. So I am not disappointed with with UNCLOS. But as I mentioned at the beginning, UNCLOS has lack to cope with very new issues. So we need to amend UNCLOS, or we need to create new rules. But unfortunately, no formal system to amend UNCLOS. So I think this conference is very important to share common normative conscience to create new rules on the law of the sea. Maybe it will take a long time, but I think the significance of this conference, one of the significance of this conference is to share common normative conscience to develop, to create international law. That is the first comment to your excellent question, thank you. And regarding enforcement of international law, and thank you for the very succinct but to the point explanation by the professor from Max Planck Institute. I think I am correct. And for instance, the ICJ International Court and United Nations Security Council International Institute. And thank you very much. I do not have anything to add to her excellent explanation. And third, my final remarks, which is at least indirectly related to your question, how to make international law meaningful, and what should be the advice to Philippines. In this regard, I would like to emphasize the importance of the Coast Guard personnel, not only from Philippines, but also other countries. Here is very important. I think this conference precisely recognizes the law enforcement organs, the significance of law enforcement organ, Coast Guard, for the maintenance of maritime order. Many conferences which deal with maritime security tend to place weights on military organs, self-defense organs. But this conference, differently from it places important weight on the law enforcement organs of those participating countries, those law enforcement organs discharge functions to enforce international law, to strengthen international law. I think this is what Commandant Mr. Kanosue tries to introduce at his last remarks. Thank you.
Thank you. Ian?
All right. So I don't think the rules-based international order has completely gone away yet. With these things, it's not an on-off switch. It's under a tremendous amount of stress. It is under a tremendous amount of erosion. Now, whether we're able to pull something together out of it, I think comes back to one of those issues I identified at the start, which is if we're able to overcome the collective action problem, whether it's in ASEAN or if ASEAN does not work, it has to be some other collection of states. That, I think, might be the way forward. So there is some way forward, but am I particularly optimistic about it? Not really. And yes, the environment has been thrown up as a way to deal with these things. You know what's happening on right now? COP. In Brazil. Lots of big players, China, the US, they're not participating. That's a major collective action problem. And the environment is your classic collective action problem, right? And to the extent that we're not able to work together on these things, what will happen is essentially what we've seen with the Trump tariffs. The whole point about going to negotiate with Trump bilaterally, there's talk about doing things multilaterally, but not really happening. Well, guess what? Those of us in Asia who talk about this sort of Asian system, that's your tributary system. That's tribute. If that's the world you like, that's where we're headed. If that's the world you don't like, then that gives reason to try to work together, right? Tribute doesn't say who you have to pay tribute to. It's just deeply hierarchical. Now, in terms of Trisha's idea about issue linkage and bargaining, I've actually very, very recently heard a fellow Malaysian of yours mention this. This is Liu Chintong in Singapore last week. This is your Deputy Minister for Investment, Trade and Industry, where he was talking about the possibility of looking at perhaps a common ASEAN industrial policy, a common tariff. These things are all possible. They allow leverage. Essentially, if you think about Southeast Asian states, if you collectively bargain, sort of like a union, right, it can work. But of course, we've had a terrible track record of getting together to work together. So again, it comes back to solving the collective action problem. I think as a first step, if we are in a world where we believe that ASEAN doesn't need change, doesn't need reform, then either we're looking for alternatives, or otherwise we're accepting that we'll just have to live in the shadow of whoever lords over us. If not, then it's about trying to find some set of mechanisms that allows us to pool our resources together to increase our bargaining leverage. Unfortunately, I don't see the political will to do that. It's an optimal solution, but I don't really see a realistic pathway to it at this point. Just before I end, what we see instead are lots of actors who say, well, if you pressure us, or if you give us this benefit, we'll go that way. And essentially, you get a bunch of states who are just easily pressured or bought over. They end up not being able to work with each other and ultimately not being able to trust each other.
Thank you. Can you hear me? No. Try again? Okay. Aizawa-san, how will China utilize the military facilities in the Spratly Islands? I think it's already evident that there's a greater willingness to bring military assets into the front line of China's enforcement. Having said that, I think we can still draw a distinction between China's willingness to enforce more aggressively over the Paracel Islands, because I think they feel more confident, and it's closer to China, it's further for aircraft like Australian aircraft to go. So we're not quite at that stage yet. But to your point, Brad, the absence of crisis, well, that's true, I agree. But if things had gone differently with that fratricidal collision in early August, we could be in a very different region, a very different world. That was very close, very close. And if we're at that level of willingness to utilize risk on the part of China, which could potentially trigger a Philippine decision to invoke the Mutual Defense Treaty, then I'm afraid the fact that those facilities are making it easier and more tempting for China to bring grey hulls in as well as white hulls bodes rather badly. Are we heading for Beck's question, are we heading for a post-UNCLOS maritime order or disorder? Like Ian, I'm not quite as pessimistic, but I do note that the liberal part of the proposition has entirely dropped out. We're not talking about the liberal part anymore, but I haven't given up on the order part. And that's why I played such stock by the importance of the archipelagic state. This is not about who gets the fish or who gets the oil. It's about the definition of the territorial integrity of the state. That matters. Southeast Asian states are very protective of their sovereignty. Indonesia seems to be rather quiescent at the moment, but that can change very quickly and in a way that can be unpredictable. If China oversteps the mark with Indonesia, I think that could really change the balance within Southeast Asia, and the order part of the equation will follow. I do think that the drift towards a more hemispheric world order is a regressive one, and that's a negative side of the second Trump administration. Its focus on the near abroad, and that brings it really back to the countries like Australia and Japan, who are in any case feeling that they have to support each other more. They have agency too, of course. They have shared normative interests. One of the points, again, to plug my report for the second time, but one of the contentions I put in there is that Canberra and Manila are currently more politically aligned than Canberra and Washington are. Now, I did that deliberately to try and get some attention, but I think there is you can certainly argue that case. And that is not a construct simply because they are allies of the United States. They have their own shared normative interests, and they want to build that relationship on a distinct but still useful track with the alliance. But that's where I think the countries like Australia and Japan really can fill some of the gap and prevent the drift to a G2. I don't think a G2 is going to happen in any case. How do you deal with a China that won't budge? Go and talk to the Vietnamese. They have an asymmetric problem, but their response to that has been to take a leaf out of China's book by engaging in land reclamation on a smaller scale, but nonetheless following the same copybook while avoiding a confrontation. The Philippines' approach to that has been somewhat different based on the transparency campaign, but the other key to it is bringing in the non-Southeast Asian like-mindeds in a coalition. The Philippines is much less isolated than it was under Duterte. We shouldn't forget that the isolation within ASEAN is discrete to that. But the international picture under the Marcos administration has been one where it really is, it's been useful in reclaiming the moral high ground. And I think that countries like Australia, Japan, the democracies have responded positively to that.
I'm glad that we have that somewhat optimistic note, because I'm not feeling at all happy about things. I would say that we've kind of gone full circle, and we're back to, if we can animate and motivate these groups in these countries, we can get something done. I would like to think that our job here would be not to ask what needs to be done, but try to figure out the ways to provide that impetus. So I guess I failed. Thank you, nevertheless. Please join me first in thanking the panelists. Secondly, I want to thank all of you for staying as long as you have. That's quite a bit of stamina and effort. And with that, I think I'll turn it over to Jeff for some final comments.
All right. I know we're all tired. Good afternoon, by the way. I have to formally end this. Let me just thank everyone for your active participation. This is just the second iteration of this dialogue, so obviously a lot of lessons learned. If you could help us with our post-event evaluation, they're on your tables. that would be helpful so we can improve next year. If you attended last year, you probably noticed that the dialogue has grown. It has doubled, or more than doubled in terms of participation. This year we have over 270 participants who are government officials, opinion leaders, and maritime security practitioners from at least 25 countries around the world. Also, while we are having our plenary sessions here in the ballroom, there were numerous track 1 meetings on the sidelines between Coast Guard agencies and between national security advisors from different countries in the region. So I hope that we were able to promote some cross-fertilization of policy ideas and we carry these genuine debates moving forward. Allow me to thank again our partner organizations that made this effort possible: the British Embassy, Manila, the Australian Embassy, Manila, Konrad Adenauer, Philippines, or Konrad Adenauer Foundation, Philippines, the UNODC, the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada, the Embassy of Japan, and the Japan Foundation, Strat-Base Institute, our partners in government, the National Security Council, the Philippine Coast Guard, and the WPS Transparency Group. We will be publishing a key findings report sometime in December, so stay tuned for that. So you know that convening a dialogue of this magnitude is quite challenging, logistics-wise. We thank you for your patience, especially with the audio. We value your feedback, so again, please help us write whatever you want to tell us on the sheet of paper. Speaking of next year, because we want to improve next year, using the feedback that you are providing now, I'm happy to announce that we will convene again in 2026 in the same week, hopefully, as the ASEAN and East Asia summits that the Philippines will be hosting. I will try to engage with other South China Sea conferences in Southeast Asia to try to reduce duplication and also to ensure that we continue to offer a unique value add to the discussions. Thank you once again and have a safe trip back home.